Today we're going to go over one of my favorite exercises for training the mid and upper back. And this is now a cable low to high row. And before we get into things, we first need to talk about the anatomy of this motion that we call retraction. So retraction, for those of you who don't know, is basically just shoulder blades moving toward the spine. But when the shoulder blades move toward the spine, and specifically when we're talking about training the middle sort of portion of the traps and the rhomboids and those kinds of things, i.e. the space between the shoulder blades, we need to talk about what retraction actually looks like, because I think a lot of people have it misunderstood. So this app, by the way, is called Complete Anatomy, and I absolutely love it. Shout out to them. And it's great for sort of demonstrating these 3D motions. And I'm going to sort of let this play, and I want you all to notice how retraction actually occurs. Now, this is probably not the full length of retraction, and I'm going to kind of play it slow motion. But what you'll note is that and I have this middle trap, by the way, highlighted in orange here. What sort of happens as the shoulder blade comes back is it also moves upward. Now, the reason that happens is not only because of the actual fiber directions that sit between the shoulder blades and the spine and how they're sort of oriented upward, right? Like if we zoom in on the rhomboid underneath of here, and we can maybe fade all of those guys, and we can look at sort of the rhomboid, this small gold space underneath, right? Those are basically the portions that will primarily function in retraction, as well as the traps. And when those things contract, they pull the scapula upward because of this thing we call the clavicle. And the clavicle now sits actually on top of the rib cage. If you look at this space right here, what you'll notice is that the clavicle actually needs, to some degree, to shift upward. This is not the full range of motion sort of displayed in this app. But a way that all of you can sort of test this on yourselves is feel your clavicle bone, right, your collarbone right here, and basically just put a finger on either end and squeeze your shoulder blade back. And what you'll notice is that the amount of motion that you have backward is limited if you try to pin your shoulder blade downward, which a lot of people will say that, which is not a paired joint action. So if you put your hands on your clavicle, your fingers on your clavicle, and you squeeze up and back, you'll actually see how much that scapula is capable of moving back with the clavicle. Again, because the clavicle is essentially where the motion is actually pivoting from. So with that in mind, what we need to do is we need to set up a motion that is sort of in accordance with that up and back motion rather than that back and down motion. Because again, back and up are scapular paired motions, back and down are not. And I'll say that repeatedly, back and up is the cue that you should be using, not back and down, which is a very commonly misunderstood thing. So without further ado, if we look at this exercise, and there's a lot of different ways to set this up, the first thing that you'll notice when I sort of plant my feet on this platform here is actually lean all the way back. And that's going to do a few things. Number one is it's going to actually angle the load direction, low to high relative to my body. So I'm pulling from an angle that's slightly low to slightly high to match up with that low to high motion of retraction. And in addition, what you'll notice is that because the load direction is oriented that way, if I move to this perspective here, it's actually very easy to stabilize through the legs, right? Because if you think about it this way, the more that you hinge over and the more close to that the cable will move from your torso at 90 degrees. So if this is your torso and this is the cable, the cable is going to be really good at sort of pulling your torso forward. But the more that you angle the cable downward relative to you, the more you can actually just push through your feet and resist that force. So not only is it going to be really convenient from a stability standpoint, but it's also, as we mentioned, going to be convenient from an alignment standpoint. So if we go back to this first view here and we look at the actual path of motion now, what I'm in sort of encouraging is motion of the upper arm and the shoulder blade at the same time. We don't want to start to try to subdivide and differentiate these things. And the reason that is because while the scapula and the clavicle and the upper arm, they're all connected, and they're all connected by a lot of stuff, and we don't want to try to separate them. So up and back of the scaps, back and up of the upper arm, and pair those things together with the low direction, you have a really, really good exercise for training the actual motion of retraction. So just in terms of the specifics here, I am using a neutral grip fixed bar. What you can do is you can use something similar. I probably wouldn't recommend using one of those traditional lat pull down bars with the straight bar. And if you are stuck with a straight bar, what I would do is I would actually loop free moving handles over it so that you can move toward a more neutral grip, or toward a grip essentially that just allows you to use a comfortable arm path. If that happens to be a fixed bar that's stuck you in this position, that's okay. But I personally prefer this because it allows for a little bit more freedom of motion around the forearm, and as a consequence, the elbow and the shoulder as well. So from there, it's going to be pretty simple. You're just basically pulling as far back and up as you can. Again, you're rowing at the same time as you're shrugging. And as long as you have this load direction, right, which is essentially parallel to the direction of those fibers that pull upward and backward, or rather the motion that those fibers are pulling the upper arms at, right? If you could see, this is the line of the cable, right, and it goes basically straight through up into my scaps. And as I'm pulling, I'm basically making sure that my feet stay nice and planted. I'm almost pushing away from the platform to the degree that is necessary to maintain contact with it, right? We don't want to start to move the torso. We don't want to start to sort of combine spinal motion with shoulder blade motion, because now that's going to be training a lot of erector type stuff. And so as long as we have these things sort of differentiated and isolated from one another, it's going to be a really, really good exercise for training that mid back. And in addition, of course, this will train stuff like some of the rear delts, some of the upper lats, at least to some degree, and other associated tissues that sort of attach to the scapula, like the levator, like the upper traps to some degree. But again, mainly just the rhomboids, the mid traps, the things that are going to function in that sort of retraction, elevation type motion. So hopefully you can all give this a try. If you've struggled to sort of grow that space between the shoulder blades, it's a fantastic option. And the last thing I'll say is what you'll notice is you'll probably have a lot of wiggle room toward the end of the range to really bang out a lot of partials, right? So what you'll notice is that toward the end of the range, I'm barely actually pulling, and maybe this will be a better angle to see. As I start to get fatigued, you'll basically be stopped by the resistance earlier than you started on the first rep. And what you'll notice is that you actually have a lot of sort of partial reps to sort of do as compared to rep 1. So if you look at the range of motion here on rep 1, right, I get all the way back to basically here, but as I get fatigued and as I continue to pull back, I'm really only pulling, just barely, right? But that amount of motion is certainly enough to generate high amounts of force in all these tissues, right, that are basically having me attempt to pull my arms backward. And as a consequence of this, you'll be actually training the full length of that specific range as compared to just the end range, where you would ultimately just get sort of stopped in this initial position, right? So you could stop when you get all the way back here, but then you're sort of missing all the range of motion that you maybe would have otherwise been able to fatigue had you just done those partials toward the end of the range. Excuse me. So that's pretty much it. It's a fairly simple motion, and I highly recommend you all give it a try. You can also do it and set it up with like a chest supported machine if that angle is very similar. Again, all these things hopefully coming back in your minds to more of a principle-based approach, and rather than just a sort of dogmatic, like do this or don't do this type approach. An alternative perhaps that I can think of would maybe be like a chest-supported row if you don't have access to cables, where you can sort of lean your chest onto an incline dumbbell or an incline bench and then grab dumbbells and do the low to high row that way. That's also a perfectly fine option. So hopefully this made sense, and hopefully you can apply it in your training if you're someone who really wants to sort of target and train that area and that motion. And if any of you have questions, as always, please leave them in the comments and I will get to them. And if any of you specifically have requests for motions that you'd like to see, muscle groups you'd like me to cover, please let me know, and I'll be happy to cover them in future videos.